My new book is outlining the insights that you will develop as you start to dig into this whole issue of emotional sobriety and start looking at the things that I challenge you with. And these insights will create some incredible aha moments, and you'll start to weave together this tapestry of emotional sobriety that's going to help you discover new possibilities in your life. So tonight we're continuing with the exploration of how the 12 steps operate to help us achieve emotional sobriety. And right now we're smack dab in the middle of step 8, right? Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And, as we've come out of step 6 and 7, where we now have committed ourselves to developing the best possible attitude that we can develop towards life, towards our relationship with ourselves, towards our relationship with our fellows, towards our relationship with our higher power, we're now tasked with this now direction of making a list of people we had harmed and becoming willing to make amends to them. And last week, I shared with you that the first person that we need to look at in terms of the harm we've done is the harm we've done to ourselves. Now, many of us have recognized that if we've been around a while, that we need to include ourselves on that list of people that we need to make amends to. But last week, I suggested that something that rarely shows up on that list of harms that we've levied towards ourselves, or the way that we've harmed ourselves, is this self-hate. And I think there's a reason for it. It's because it's been operating in our life for such a long time, we don't even recognize it as an ongoing dynamic. It is always an undercurrent to everything that is going on in our life. So we're very unaware of how we feed, how we fuel, and how we sustain and reinforce this self-hating dynamism. And what's so important in this step is to increase our awareness. Emotional sobriety is dependent on an increase in our awareness of ourself and how we function. I've been trained as a Gestalt therapist, and I love Fritz Perls and all of the contributions he made to this way of working with people. And one of the things he said is that we must take full responsibility for the existence that we've created. He says, without taking full responsibility for it, we're unable to change our life. Well, I'm glad somebody agreed with that, because I think that that's so true, is that if I take responsibility for my existence, I'm also taking responsibility for how I hate myself and how I continue to sustain that self-hate dynamism in my life. So we are going to be digging into today more about this self-hate process. We're going to look at the etiology of it, what has caused it in our lives, and we're going to start to become aware of it. Because one of the things that we're going to see is that what we do is, if I haven't cleaned this up in my life, then I'm going to project it onto other people. And when we start to look at how we've harmed others, we're going to look at it through the lens of how has our self-hate showed up in harming our relationships with others, in our attitude towards other people. How have we done to other people what we're doing to ourselves. In fact, many times I've called that the real golden rule, is we treat other people the way we treat ourselves. And that's not good news if this self-hate process is going on unchecked. And for many of us, it has been unchecked our entire lives. I believe that this is one of the reasons why people that are in long-term recovery end up relapsing, is they've never addressed their self-hate, and that it comes around and gets them at some particular point in time. So we learn to hate ourselves very early in life. And we learn it, there's two influences, one is clearly the culture we live in. And we'll get into that. We'll talk about that a little bit more next time. I don't want to focus on that today, other than to say that our culture sets us up with a lot of crazy ideas about who we are. And just a quick thought about that. I like Eric Fromm, who was an incredibly brilliant man. He was a psychoanalyst and a sociologist. And, he used to say that in our culture, it's so based on having, that we've all internalized this idea, I am more the more I have. And we'll get into that, and we'll get into how that contributes to this self-hate in terms of setting up an idealized self next week when we continue this discussion. But today, I want to talk about how we are victims of people that have been victims themselves. I want to look at the parental influences. I think many of you were quite moved when Roger was talking about what he called the introjections, how we take our parental attitudes towards us and we now take their attitudes and they become our own. That process, the psychological term for that process is called introjecting. I am taking their idea and I'm internalizing it, and I am now looking at myself through their eyes. Them uncritically, though, I'm never challenging whether they're wrong in terms of what they're saying about me, because I'm so young. I want to cooperate. I want to please them. So we take this stuff on, we internalize it. And we internalize it. It's even in terms of sometimes the injunctions that they've given us about don't be this, don't be that. Any of those don'ts means that who I am as a person is being rejected. Don't cry about that. You've got nothing to cry about. Have you ever heard that? Or I'm going to give you something to cry about. You're crying, I'll really give you something to cry about. Or my God, you're ungrateful. There's kids in China that aren't eating. How come you're not eating all your food? Those were some of the messages I got growing up. And we've all had a certain set of messages. If our parents have lost their spontaneity in life, if they've lost connection with who they are, if they respond and behave in anxiety-ridden patterns, they're going to transmit their self-hating postures onto us. Their anxiety is going to be passed on in the shape of this self-hate, because what's going to happen is they're going to either reject us in full or in part. And if we're rejected in part or in full, the effect is the same, is we're going to end up looking at ourselves in that same way and rejecting ourselves. This goes on very, very, very early in our life. And when it starts, it continues. And that's why I'm saying there is a self-hating dynamic that is operating all the time in our life until we take a look at it and start to actively engage it. I came up with the phrase today, in order to deal with some of these things, not only do we have to name it, but we have to claim it if we're going to change it. That's the process that's involved here. Claiming it means that I own my self-hate. And as I started to think about this, it's something I don't do actively enough in my own recovery. When I stumbled across this last time and I started to talk about it, I says, my God, This is something I haven't been paying enough attention to in my own life. How much is this still going on for me, and how actively do I pursue it and seek it out to engage it and start to challenge this process inside me? Not enough. And I don't think any of us do it enough. So let's look at some of the parental attitudes in terms of what they had towards us, and then what is the effect on us in terms of this. And we're looking at this because I don't want you to just think about us as being a victim of this, but I want you to hear what their attitude is, how that affects us, and then we're going to be looking at how we transmit that attitude to others. So I want this exercise to be one of helping you become aware of this process and how dynamic it is in our life. Now, if we have a parent that was grossly over permissive, the laissez-faire approach to parenting, what was it called? The hippie approach. Do whatever you want to do. And it was seemingly like they didn't care. It's very interesting. Nathaniel Branden said, I thought a brilliant thing at one point in time. He says, you can damage a kid's self-esteem in two ways. He says, you can damage a kid's self-esteem by having too much expectation, by expecting them to be something that they can never be. But you can also damage a child's self-esteem by not expecting enough of them. We often think of the former, not the latter. How do you damage a kid's self-esteem? By not expecting enough of them. Well, what gets translated is, I am a person that's not worth caring about. I am a person that doesn't have the potential to really become anything. That is the message that we pick up as a child from that kind of parenting. If we have an overbearing, stifling, controlling parent that's always looking at, that's not right. Let me do this for you. Don't do that. You're going to do it wrong. Don't spill that. Oh my God. All of that kind of stuff. What ends up happening is we end up seeing ourselves as incredibly incompetent and incapable. And we become crippled. We're now these fragile people that we're incapable of really doing anything because we're going to screw it up. So that we have this vulnerable fragmentation of ourselves as a person. We don't view ourselves as a separate, whole, and capable human being. We view ourselves as a human being that's incapable. And so we get anxious if we're going to try something new. We get quite frightened about that. And oftentimes, a parent is doing that because they want to be helpful. I want to help you out. You can't do that now. Let me do that for you. Well, who fucking cares if the kid fucking pours the milk and spills it on the table when they're trying to learn how to pour milk? Is it that fucking important that they don't spill the milk? What are we doing? Are we missing seeing that this child is trying to figure something out? And maybe we just put a towel underneath it and say, hey, go ahead and figure that out. That's an important thing to learn in your life, how to pour that milk. How many parents have done that with their kids? Not many. Oh my God, you're going to spill that. Oh shit. There's no more cows. They're not going to make any more milk. Come on, Mom, Dad, back off. There's a lot of fucking cows out there. Jesus Christ, leave me alone. Let me grow up, please. Or we get the parent that's so punitive, right? They're overbearing, or they might even be sadistic, right? So what happens if a parent is punitive all the time and you're being punished for what you're doing, even things that aren't that big of a thing, but they're treated like it's the worst crime in the world, then we're going to view ourselves as having that we're monsters, that we can't trust ourselves. We can't trust anything about us. Our instincts, our impulses are bad. They're wrong. They're terrible, and they have to be curtailed. If the parent expresses a disrespect for the child, starts calling the child names or faulting them for how they're responding in a situation, the child's message is, I, I wish to be something other than I am so that my mom or dad would love me. Because obviously who I am is not capable of having their love. If a parent is overzealous and excessively stringent, then what that child is going to do is develop this harsh conscience, and they're going to castigate themselves and just come down on themselves viciously if they make mistakes. So, what this equals is that there's three real styles. If we really kind of boil these things down, there's the laissez-faire parent that says, do anything you want, figure it out. And that damages a child and sends that message that starts the child hating themselves because I'm not someone that's worth being cared for. There's the dismissive parent that does not acknowledge and see the child and who they are. And then the child ends up hating who they are and unable to see who they are. And then when there's disapproval added to that, now that dismissing not only makes us miss ourselves and feel that we're really not worthy of being seen, but now we also put on it a judgment that we're bad. These things, and as you're going to hear next week when we talk about some of the cultural messages that we get based on the man rules and the woman rules and all the crazy rules in our culture, all of these things start to combine and conspire to a relationship or with ourself that creates this self-hate. And that becomes a core value in us. It just came to me today that a lot of people start therapy because they hate themselves, not because they are compassionate and love themselves. They start therapy to change themselves. It's an interesting thing that we can do the right thing for the wrong reasons, can't we? Starting therapy can be a really good thing. Coming into recovery. How many people come into recovery because they hate themselves and what they've become? Not because they have compassion for themselves and love themselves and want to create a better life for themselves. It doesn't happen because the self-hate is such a central motivating force in our life. It drives most of our decisions until we tackle it and start to address it. Now, if you sat and said to me, well, okay, Dr. Berger, this sounds all great. Well, what the hell does this have to do with emotional sobriety, right? Where does this fit into this whole thing? This is a bunch of psychobabble stuff, And I would say it is psychobabble. It's kind of psychobabble I enjoy engaging in. But where it's relevant to emotional sobriety is about freedom. That's what recovery is about. It's about freedom. It's not about becoming successful. It's not about getting everything back that you've lost. It's becoming free. There can be no personal freedom if you're still hating yourself. Those become the bars of the prison that you've created that have locked you in and have shut down your potential. Emotional sobriety is about freedom. It's about letting go of our old ideas. And there's no old idea that needs to be changed more than this self-hating process and all of the beliefs that have spawned this self-hate. So next week, we'll talk about some of the cultural influences that get us. And then I think one week I want to go into some of the ways that self-hate manifests itself. And then we will start talking about how this shows up in terms of how we harm others with it. So with that being said, I will now turn to my distinguished colleagues Rogers had a lot to say later.
Well, no, he's
what did Patrick say? Roger's spitting fire.
spitting fire.
Spitting fire. I like it. Spitting fire.
I'm in a mood right now because I love how you speak about self-hatred, Thom, and how personal you, from your own life experience, you talk about it from. So if you're up for it, I defer to you.
You're a fan of you're a fan of me because I hate myself.
I'm a fan of you because you hate yourself.
That's what I heard him say, Thom.
But here it is, Thom.
You hate yourself in a very special way.
Well, here's how I say it. You hate yourself so eloquently, man. That's the key.
Well, that's the writer in him. My God, that's what it is. That's the writer in him. See?
So let us hear.
So we'll have to start classifying. You have eloquent self-hate.
Let us benefit from your eloquent self-hatred. All right. Go ahead, man.
We'll start with what. Just let me confess how confusing it is to feel so tremendously good about how well I self-hate. It's like how do you figure that out? I love the idea, Alan, of adding, and I never have thought of it this way at all. I love the idea of adding to the 8th step as we prepare. Well, the way I wrote it down is, how has my self-hatred and basically just never being on my own side contributed to my harming others? What a huge missing piece. You're right about that. It's like, it's such a missing piece that and I love the idea of thinking of that connection as I formulate my thoughts about this. But I love having that as a new tool to bring to people to say, because when whenever we start talking about adding ourselves to the people we need to make amends to, it's like inevitably there are people who just misinterpret that as being like more selfish. It's like, here we go again. Really associated with the psychobabble of, like, you know, the criticism of therapy, especially back in the 80s and 90s, I would say, that was very warranted in a lot of ways, that people just went to therapy and became self-absorbed, because I was among that group. And but I love this idea of actually being able to put it in there. And it's like, and I don't know, what I'm going to say here may disappoint Roger, and, you know, of course, I'll just have to feel bad about myself later. But it's what I want to talk about from what you said, and I'll try to be brief about it. It's like about the ways that we get this from our parents, because I'm a good example. I will talk about myself. I didn't get the way I felt horrible about myself because my parents treated me badly and said horrible things to me. Any of the messages I can tell you that I carried with me for so long about my should monster, all this stuff, so not one of them ever was scripted by one of my parents, not toward me. You know, I can do this bit. I can do this bit with my mom too, but I'll do it with my dad tonight. I grew up as a child of a horribly self-hating man, a shame-filled man who, now we can go to his life and I can show you easily how he got to be that way. He got to be that way the old-fashioned way. Like when I went to group therapy initially and start hearing these people talking about their abuse and how they were abused all the time, I began to be, and I'm sure there are people here who can identify with this, I began to speak in this strange way envious of them because they had something to point to and say, this is how I got to be this way, you know? And I was going like, I don't have that. I don't have any of that. You know, the words that my parents said to me, they were good, and they supported me. And you know, and so it was very confusing. But then I got with a wonderful therapist who helped me understand at one point, just one of those moments in time when she said, we were talking about my shame, and she says, you know what, that doesn't belong to you. Mm-hmm. And I looked up and said, what do you mean? And she says, that's your dad's. Mm-hmm. That's your dad's. He didn't mean, and she said, I think she said something at least very similar to this. He didn't mean to give it to you, but he didn't do it. He didn't know what to do. He didn't do anything with it. Right. And so you have it. My dad said to me, the words were, be proud of yourself. do whatever you want to do, be free. Because he had a life, even in his adult life, he felt controlled by my mom, by his father, this other stuff. He was beaten on a regular basis as a kid by an alcoholic father. It's like all those things. But he would say, be proud of yourself, do what you want to do, follow your dream. And then there was the implied, it was always implied, but I do know that he actually said this out loud several times. Whatever you do, don't be like me.
Yeah.
You know, what his message to me was save yourself.
Yeah.
You know, that he was not going to get out, and he didn't. I wrote a book called the Self-Forgiveness Handbook, and in 1996, I think, and I dedicated it to my father and my mom. But to my father, I put in the beginning, and I didn't talk about this in the book, but it's like I said my dad was the person who taught me the most about the importance of self-forgiveness. And what I didn't say in that book, I've talked about much since then, is he taught me that specifically by showing me, demonstrating to me what it's like to live and die without it.
Right.
And it broke my heart to see him that way. He lived with a broken heart. And you know, so I sit here and I can have all this compassion for him and stuff, but I tell you what, here's what it comes down to. I remember being at a Bedford Combs week-long treatment program. We were doing those codependent week-long intensives, and we had everybody set up to role play our different members of the family, and there was my mother up on the chair, you know, showing control over everything, and there was somebody role playing my father over in the corner with his head in his hand. And I looked over at the person playing my father, and I could not figure out for the life of me why I was so fucking rageful at him. There was no reason in the world that I knew that why would I be mad at that man, that wonderful man? It's like, you know, and he was a wonderful man. I still in my heart is a wonderful man, but he didn't teach me what I needed, and he didn't get himself out of any of that, and therefore I was left with it. And I think my other siblings as well were left with a lot of it. So the message here, because I know we're dealing with a short amount of time, but the message here is we don't just learn from how we're treated. We learn from how the people who are bringing us up treat themselves.
Yeah.
We absorb it. And, you know, and it's like, I don't know how I got it to this day, but we absorb it. We get it in there, and it's like, once you know, she says it's not, my therapist said it's not yours, it's his. What I know now with hindsight is by that time, though, it was mine. You know, I had my version of it, and it's like Robert Subby says in Lost in the Shuffle, you know, as children were victims, as adults were volunteers. I had already figured out my way of imposing this on myself. So you know, whether, you know, and I appreciate the fact that my father never intended me to take on his legacy that way, but it was mine, and it has been mine. And I just can't help but tell this one story because it's just heartwarming for me. That toward the end of my dad's life, I was doing a workshop here when I was already living in Tennessee. I was doing a workshop for a large group of people at a small college near here about self-compassion. And he was in the hospital. He had cancer, and he was not long for this world. And I went back. I went directly from there to see him in the hospital, and I didn't know if this was going to make any sense to him. But I said, you know, Dad, I want you to know that if yours and my life was one life, just one life from when you were born in 1916. You know, until where we were at the time was around 1991. I said, we've come a long way because I talked about the shame. I talked about, you know, I said, because we had talked about some of that, and I knew a lot about his childhood at that time. And I said, because you felt so bad about yourself, you know, and you had to abandon all of your dreams. But I said, I can't do this without crying. I just came from a job in which I was teaching a whole room full of people how to love themselves, because I know how to do it. I said, I want you to know that's yours too. I wanted to give him something back. I don't know if he got it. I don't know about any of that, but I did get to say that to him, and it still means the world to me. And it means to me, I'll just say, because it's this group that I just appreciate being able to share that with you guys, because it's a great memory for me right now. So that's what I got.
Look, Thom, it's first of all, I so appreciate, how authentic you are about this stuff, right? That what Roger was really mentioning in the beginning of this. But, one of the things that I want to highlight in what you're saying is that what changed that is when you differentiated yourself from him.
Yep, absolutely.
When that therapist said to you that was his, not yours, that forced you to go, what?
Mm-hmm.
Wait a minute.
How can that be?
It was an EMDR session without the EMDR. You were reorganizing your brain around this whole trauma that you had, and you really stopped taking it personal. And we were going to see that theme about not taking things personally is an incredibly powerful tool to differentiate yourselves.
Yeah.
So that's right on. And you're right on. I mean, that's why I said we're victims of people that are victims themselves.
Yeah.
So, it's I love Virginia Satir's image of, imagine that none of our umbilical cords are ever cut. If you want to know the influence in your life, just imagine how the history that we have, the genealogy we have to this thing. So that's right on. Raj, you want to throw something in before we open it up for everybody to?
I just want to, what you're sharing brought up, Thom, for me is two things. One is, and I'm so glad you're emphasizing this too, Al, we're not talking about this in order to become more blameful toward our parents, right? That's not what liberates us at all. It's like they come by their coping styles and their ways of dealing with their feelings in life. Honestly, we come by ours the same way, right? We do the best that we can. But it is about facing the reality, especially as of adults, like you're saying, Alan, that I need to become aware of what those ways of coping are that I developed, and how destructive they can be, both for me and for others. The other part I want to share is that we can be of most value to ourselves and to others based on what we've become aware of and able to learn for ourselves, what we have been through personally. We are best suited to be able to be of value to others as long as we have understood what we've needed to understand and are able to have the awareness we need and make the changes we need. If I've traveled that road myself in terms of overcoming, for me, the messages I got, literally, my dad was the principal of the school that I went to growing up. And we were told by my mom that we were supposed to be models for other kids to look to. And I internalized that in a really deep way. And I think what we judge in ourselves, even if we treat other people a lot better than we treat ourselves, is also what we judge in others, right? And what we accept in ourselves is what we are more able, at least, to accept in others. But it's through facing and working through this grief and the sadness, the rage and the anger, the fear, or even terror, if there was abuse in your family or violence. There's no harder path than that, right? But there's also no more rewarding or informing path than that in terms of understanding ourselves and understanding other people and finding a way to feel compassion toward ourselves and other people. So those are just some of the thoughts that come to me. And then I very much want to open it up to the group. So thank you.
I want to acknowledge some of the things that are being said in chat, by the way. I love the comments that people are putting in. And there was a comment earlier that I really want to recognize, is that someone says, this is almost too painful to listen to. I mean, I appreciate that, Anne-Marie. You shared that with us. And look, it is. These last few talks have been the most difficult for me. I felt a bit depressed in doing them because I am getting in touch with this process of me more and more as I talk about it. It's making me much more aware. You know, Roger and I talk a lot about when we work with people, just raise your awareness by 5%. Well, I've raised it by about 20%. Tone it down a little bit because it's a little too much. It's like turn off the spigot, right? There's a little too much water running. Yeah. But I appreciate that very much. Somebody else said something, and we will be talking about this at points in time. Is there a difference between shame and self-hate, or does self-hate spawn shame? Very good question. Very good. If at the least they're kissing cousins, let's put it that way, right? They're kissing cousins. But
and it just becomes about defining terms. A lot of times people get way confused because of certain terms. We just have to, you know, it's like we can, you know, people talk about healthy shame and unhealthy shame. It's like it's just be sure everybody's on the same page with the language.
My new book is outlining the insights that you will develop as you start to dig into this whole issue of emotional sobriety and start looking at the things that I challenge you with. And these insights will create some incredible aha moments, and you'll start to weave together this tapestry of emotional sobriety that's going to help you discover new possibilities in your life.